All right, my name is Mike Clawson. I'm Illuman's Administrator. We're here at the Illuman tent at the Wild Goose Festival, an annual pilgrimage for me and for my dear friend and teacher, Micky ScottBey Jones, sometimes known as the Justice Doula, also a teacher on the Enneagram, among many, many, many other things. And we've invited Micky to come join us to talk about some of the themes that Illuman is all about, which is healthy masculinity, contemplative spirituality, male spirituality, whatever that means, and just what we might be able to do to address what some have called the crisis of masculinity in our culture. And we might even just talk about what that even is or even might be, if it's a thing. So, yeah, let's get started.
Yeah.
So the first question, like I said, what's wrong with men? No, let me phrase that better. What is the state of men in our culture? By our culture, let's just say Western, North American culture. And yeah, what is the state of masculinity of men? Is there a crisis of masculinity? What's going well? I mean, take it wherever you want.
Okay. Well, thanks for asking me that question, because I think that men need to do the work and masculine people need to do the work. This is a question for all of us. This is something we all have stakes in. So I think that we need to be talking about it, and we need to ask multiple people, because I'm impacted by men and by masculine people, no matter who I'm partnered with. I also have children who are partnered with people, and that, they're impacted by that. My children have a father, like all of these things, right? So I just think asking is part of even getting to the point where we might be able to determine what's wrong with men or what's going on with men and masculinity.
Well, and I wanted to say, part of the reason I asked you to do this is I think it's really important for men to listen to outside perspectives, to women and to female-bodied persons, to say, what is your experience of us, and what do we need to know? What would you want us to know? So
Yeah.
that's part of, I'm eager to hear.
Yeah. Yes, I am a cisgender woman, and I have been in relationships with men. I'm with a masculine, non-binary person now, and so I do think about these things. And I mean, yeah, we can talk about what's wrong, or I guess we can talk about the state of masculinity. And one thing that's been really interesting to me as I have expanded my understanding of my sexuality, and I've been in a lot of different conversations as someone who's in a lot of justice circles, and also still in a lot of faith-rooted circles. The conversation around masculinity outside of gender, like outside of just men.
Right.
Like masculine women, masculine non-binary people, just what is masculinity when we take it just, when we expand it maybe beyond body parts, beyond gender. And, what is masculinity versus what's kind of performing masculinity? What is toxic instead of just calling it all toxic?
Right.
What's really beautiful and good about it? And what does it mean to actually pursue the goodness of it? And I sometimes just am observing those conversations, but I've been able to have some of those conversations, especially with trans men and masculine center people, no matter their gender, non-binary women, whatever. And so having those conversations and knowing they're in conversation with other people has been really helpful for me in expanding my view and understanding, and even in some ways like softening me, because I think as a protective measure, sometimes I've had kind of a protection or a hardness towards masculine people, even though they're involved in my life and I'm attracted to masculinity. I feel a need to protect myself sometimes. So it softens I can soften towards people that are like at least trying to have the conversation.
What's I mean, the answers might be obvious, but what causes that hardness or that ability, that need to sort of be guarded or protective about yourself around men and masculine persons? I mean, as a woman, what's the danger? Again, maybe it's obvious, but I would love for you to name some of that.
I mean, yeah, there are things that feel sort of obvious, like physical danger, which I have experienced, things like assault, and, physical intimidation and that kind of thing. But I also think it's the emotional stuff, and it's not just like anger or rage. It's also the unevenness of relationships, right? The way we infantilize men, and we're like, I just saw this thread on Twitter the other day about like a mom trying to arrange a birthday party for her child, and the dads were like, here's my wife's email, like, and people kind of debating that, like, and dad's talking about, well, she keeps the calendar, she can keep up with things, I can, and like the ways we just kind of, and I've noticed this myself as a mother, like not expecting my boys to do as many chores, or and even treating different boy children differently, because their masculinity is different, right? And like maybe one's more nurturing, so of course I expect him to make dinner more, or the other one that doesn't, is more aloof and kind of the quiet, silent type, so he doesn't need to make dinner, he does other things, right? So like how I'm even reinforcing these things in certain ways, and like not, whereas my girl was super prepared to leave the home, could cook and could take care of her bills, like do all the things, and not necessarily preparing my boys in the same way. And I'm a womanist, I'm a feminist, like why, like how is this happening with me? But even how I'm contributing. And so like developing my own awareness, because that's her. If then they partner with female people, with feminine people, it's like, how have I contributed to that next generation, right? Of like boys who grow into men who can't cook a meal because I didn't help them learn those skills at home, even though that I wouldn't say I believe in those gender roles, but how have I perpetrated it, right? Yeah. So I'm just like, it's not just about violence, because I think when we go to harm, it's like violence. It's also the like uneven relationships, the way we don't like I don't know, like how often men don't have friends or a close circle, right? And how can I just help them be more human, encourage that in my own children and the men or masculine people around me, instead of just like falling back into some of those gender roles that end up hurting us, all of us.
We were just talking with Brian McLaren before this, and one of the things that Brian brought up was just the systems and structures of patriarchy that overarch all of us, that we all sort of suffer from. And one of the big things that I've noticed as a man is patriarchy hurts women, it also hurts me. And I'm also a perpetrator of patriarchy, and I think a little bit of what I'm saying, if I put it harshly, is you see your ways that you have perpetrated patriarchal assumptions in your life. And so we're all wrapped up in this system and even become, culpable for it in subtle, small ways or big ways. And yet, growing up as a young man where you couldn't express your emotions and you couldn't be a certain way, and if you couldn't express yourself in a certain way, you couldn't like certain things without ridicule or being assumed to be less masculine, less of a man. And so we live inside this box. Men, are forced inside this box, constrain us to conformity. And of course, women have had that same box that they've been busting out of for years. And in a way, I feel like women are, and especially women of color like yourself, but also queer men and women and non-binary folks, they're way ahead of us. And by us, I mean cisgendered white men like myself, that are only just now getting around to figuring out, how do we bust out of that box? And I'm wondering, are there any lessons, things that folks in your community and your demographics have learned that we could learn from so that we can get caught up?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I do think listening to and being in conversation with, like I was saying, these people that are taking masculinity outside of gender, like who are masculine presenting women, masculine non-binary or genderqueer folks who are kind of forcing the conversation beyond just like who we would traditionally call men, and examining, because sometimes what happens is, like I see this in queer community, is then they're just reproducing the same kind of toxic masculinity. So like the people that are having these conversations about how do we move it out of that are like, there's nothing to fall back on because they're not going to fit the accepted stereotypes, so they have to create a new masculinity or a different masculinity or expanded masculinity. They don't have a choice because they're not going to be accepted as men, per se, right? So then that even allows us to talk about kind of the masculine and feminine energies in everybody, and have a conversation about what does it look like to embrace all of that within ourselves.
You want to define that for a second? Like, what is masculine and feminine energy? I mean, I get a little like nervous talking about energy in general because it's just so nebulous, and what do we even mean? But like, I'm curious. Like, what do we mean when we say masculine energy? What do we mean when we say feminine energy? I think it's real. I mean, I think there's something we're pointing to. But what is it?
I mean, it's super woo-woo, right? You said at the beginning, that I do Enneagram and stuff, and within the symbol of the Enneagram is a triangle. And, all of its sacred geometry together, the circle, the triangle, the hexad, but we can also pull them apart. And we use the triangle often to talk about kind of that masculine, feminine energy, and then kind of this middle, because a triangle isn't, just a binary. It is like you're going to be going to those 3 points, and everywhere in between, you have all that space in between the triangle. So it's not even about it being balanced per se. It's not even
like
about
you should be like 50-50
right.
masculine and feminine or something.
Yeah, so it's not be all masculine, be all feminine, and it's not about stereotypes either. I think it's like, we do see, though, even if we take it out of human beings and into kind of the natural world, right, we see like sometimes I remember hearing about like the feminine energy of trees, right, and they like form these networks underground where they're giving each other nutrients and kind of sending signals to one another, and taking care of the forest, so like that being kind of a feminine energy, and maybe like the tree tops and the protection of the leaves as a masculine energy, like a covering. And of course you can get too toxic in any of these. You can get like way far off, but any religion, any if you look into practices of ancient peoples throughout Africa, throughout indigenous worlds, you're going to find these masculine and feminine energies, and it's never about, or rarely, I don't know if I can say never, but it's rarely about like power that's given to you because you have masculine energy or feminine energy. We have different roles or different things that we do, a lot of my theological training has been from indigenous folks, and it's like in some indigenous cultures, what you'll find is like, while they may have had a male chief, they had a female council that determined the chief, with old and young. The elders would be in charge of starting the community meeting, but they didn't start until they saw all the young people come in the room, right? So it's that kind of thing. Like, it's really hard to pull that apart because colonization came in and kind of and didn't understand what they were seeing about this sharing of power and this connection between, masculine and feminine, and so tried to rearrange it. But that's why when I've talked to my indigenous uncles and aunties and teachers, they're like, the patriarchy isn't our number one problem. That's not what you can have your little feminist thing, like that's great, but what we're interested in is decolonization, because it was colonization that brought all of this, that tried to restructure the way we relate to each other as human beings. And even within all that masculine and feminine stuff, they also had additional genders. So it was never just either or. They also recognized that there is this kind of dance between genders and people who embody that dance, and that those people are really who we need to be learning from, because they're not so pulled to one end of the triangle or the spectrum.
It's been so fascinating to me. I'm a historian, and so I love digging into the histories of these ancient cultures for contemporary cultures, but non-Western indigenous peoples, and really lots of cultures, or whether civilizations or folks that are living more closer to the land. There's so much more flexibility and fluidity, usually, not universally across the board, but in a lot of these cultures, around gender and performances of gender and the roles that you can take. And I think maybe a little bit of what I was even just thinking about the somewhere between 6 to 8 words for gender in Hebrew, in like the ancient Jewish tradition, like the pre-New Testament tradition, the world that Jesus would have been familiar with. They already had at least half a dozen different genders that they could categories that they could think in. And so, and Jesus named some of these in some of his teaching. He talked about people who are born eunuchs and people who are made eunuchs. Well, that's the ancient equivalent of different types of transgender folks, Anyway, so it's just, and so when you're talking about masculine and feminine energy, a little bit of what I hear you saying is it's different ways of showing up in the world. It's different ways of being, and people in some cultures and at certain times have had the freedom to kind of show up in the way that feels best, and maybe at different times to show up. I have lots of genderqueer friends who, today I want to present masculine, today I want to present feminine, and they've busted out of that box that we were talking about earlier because they had to, like you said. And maybe part of what we're working towards is creating, breaking down these boxes so that people can show up in whatever kind of masculine, feminine combination thereof. It's about liberation.
Yeah.
To be liberated, to just be who you are and how you want to be, and different things at different times.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. And to heal maybe the parts of us that have been told can't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. That you, in order to be respected or belong or to be loved, you have to, you have to take this part of you and you need to bury it a little bit, or you need to hide it from most people or whatever. And there's so much. And I don't know exactly, what you all do on your weekends and how much you share about that, but I would love to know if you feel like that is part of it, is like kind of welcoming all the parts of you, and like the part isn't masculine because it matches up with what the idea of masculinity has been, but like I know myself as a man, and so this is a part of me, so it's manly, it's masculine. That would seem like that would be part of the healing, to allow all of you to belong.
That starts to get into where I wanted to go with this, of what is it going to take to effect this liberation, to heal those broken or repressed parts of masculine identities, but also what does a masculine spirituality look like? And on our Men's Rites of Passage weekends, and even in our council groups, our small groups, one of the admonitions is to speak from the heart and listen from the heart. In other words, just show up with your complete, authentic self. Have the courage, which is sometimes a virtue we associate with masculinity, that kind of warrior energy. Step forward and do the dangerous, scary thing that is actually the necessary, needed thing. and so can you be man enough, I guess, in that sense, to be vulnerable, to be your real self, even if that real self doesn't feel masculine in the ways that you've been told you have to be. And so we have practices that encourage and allow men to practice that vulnerability and to strip away. A lot of what we do focuses on stripping away the egoic self, the constructed self that we put up to protect what's inside, and to not have to show the real selves to the world, right? And we try to create a context where you can, where you confront that, and you and then you begin to break it down or even kill it. Because until it dies, you can't. The true self can't emerge. We also do a lot with confronting core wounds. What was it that hurt you, that caused you to have to create that false self in the first place? There's a butterfly that just landed at our feet as we were talking, which is interesting because so much of what we do with Illuman, to tie it back in, is about transformation.
Okay.
And
we had a little visitor.
What's a better metaphor and image of transformation than the butterfly? Right? That was
cool.
Yeah. I wish we could have turned the camera down so everyone could see the beautiful butterfly. What else? I mean, if you were going to say things that you have worked, because I know that you are trained and experienced in spiritual practices and spiritual healing. You've worked in kind of movement chaplaincy to help folks that are on the front lines of justice work. You've done all kinds of things like that. What works and what's needed to help, and maybe for men especially, if you can think about it in those terms, to help us do that work, what we've been talking about?
Well, I don't know if I know what works, but when I think about it, I think about, again, opening yourself up to yourself in a way, like opening yourself to the parts that you've been told can't exist or can't coexist with the rest of you. And I think sometimes the way you do that is actually by being in conversation with people who are radically different from you, or you think are radically different from you, who maybe have refused to put those parts of themselves away. And I know I feel like I have a theme here, but like trans men, like what can you learn? Like read a book by a trans man, read a book by, if you're white, by a black man, and like that's not necessarily about race or not necessarily about being trans. Like, I mean, yes, those are good too, and can be a really good starting point, especially if you just want to know about their life experience. But like exposing yourself to those viewpoints, and not like it's one viewpoint, but like that can be one way to shake you out of an idea that maybe like isn't this just how everybody experiences life, right? And then there may be points of resonance and points that are so divergent that it's, wow, I didn't even know that existed, right? So I think that's part of it, is just I'm going to just have resources and references that are not what I would normally go to, which takes some research and finding those authors and putting it out there, asking people, whatever, like going to your library, going to a bookstore and saying, hey, I really want to read these kinds of folks, and I want it to, expand, because then once you start reading one person, or watching videos of one person, like then it leads to another, and it leads to you start to find out these worlds that you didn't even know existed. So I think that's one of the ways like people expand their spirituality, their thoughts, because not all of us live in places where you're just going to be friends with somebody who's bringing that other experience, especially of masculinity, like I said, trans men or masculine presenting women, that kind of thing. So I think that's a big piece of it. I work with the Enneagram. I think we really do talk about ego, like personality, is really related to ego, and then we talk about the essence or true self. And I'm not so much into like killing your ego. I mean, maybe that's what some people need, but like your ego did a pretty good job keeping you alive.
Yeah.
So how do we acknowledge that? I mean, I'm kind of a like internal family systems parts work kind of person that like none of those parts are bad.
Yeah.
But they will keep your attention. Like if you don't listen to that part, it's going to keep knocking on the door until you deal with it. And so how do you then, because that's why some of us are so afraid to even talk to that part.
Yeah.
And so we just try and keep it hidden, but it's getting louder and louder and louder and louder. So when you actually talk to it, it can calm down.
Yeah.
So maybe that, if you've been arguing with your masculinity, and it's been having to fight and be like, no, I'm going to keep asserting myself. Well, if you just have a conversation with it, it'll quiet,
One of the things we did at my rites of passage in May, just did mine, we talked about thanking our egos, thanking our false selves.
Yeah.
They were protecting us, like you said. They were doing, we constructed them for a reason, and maybe we needed them at a time, but now they no longer serve. And the thing, you hear that a lot in like yoga or whatever. It's like release what no longer serves you. And that was a theme of, honor it. It's not bad. Your shadow side, your shadow self, your false self, your ego, these are not bad. But sometimes they stop serving the purpose that that they were supposed to, and there's a need for transformation and transition to something new. And
I think often men and masculine people are allowed to kind of live an unexamined life. So just engaging in that self-examination, engaging in inner work can start to unlock things for you, right? Like not being part of the status quo that just lives this unexamined life. Like, I don't know, I just watch football on the weekends and I go to work and I play with my kids, but you don't like, of course you don't just want to be navel gazing and you're never actually doing anything, but it's like with that self-work, with that self-examination, then comes choice points about, now I'm going to choose to do this. I'm going to actually walk in solidarity with women in this way. I'm actually going to do this with the people in my life, like both masculine and feminine people in my life. Like you then start to have choices open to you about what you want to do with that examination, the information you gather from that examination,
Yeah.
And so that's really where it becomes powerful, because the systems of oppression want to keep you plugged in and not paying attention. They want to keep you unexamined. And so when you can start to examine, you're like, whoa, pull out of the matrix essentially, and it's like, oh, I do have choice about this. I don't just have to live my life the way we're being told is the way to live, or these are the confines, and this is what makes me a man. So I think that's what's really exciting about this work, is just you're inviting men, if nothing else, to just examine themselves.
One of the revolutionary things that I've taken from since my MROP just a couple months ago is to check in with myself, which is weird to say because I'm 43 and you think I would have learned this before, but I have these codependent tendencies where I tend to take care of everyone but myself. I think a lot of men do that. You take care of everyone but yourself. This is why, I was a youth pastor once, and we led a bunch of kids on a trip, and one of the kids broke his foot, but none of us knew it until after he got home from this mission trip to Spain.
No.
Because he was like, oh, it's no big deal. I'm just gonna keep walking on it. It's no problem. And he for whatever reason, he thought he shouldn't let on that he was suffering and in pain, had actually broken his foot. And I mean, think about how often men are taught to just stuff it down, to suck it up, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain. And so for me, just pausing long enough to say, wait, what do I want? How am I doing? What's going on inside? It's revolutionary for me. I want to touch on one more kind of difficult question, at least for me. Who should men be doing this kind of work with? because sometimes we don't know other men that we can do this with. Sometimes our only intimate relationships where we feel we can be real are with women, and yet then that puts this burden on women to have to play that therapist role, whatever, with the men in their lives, and it can be exhausting. In the same way that people of color often talk about, listen, if you want us to have to explain racism to you over and over and over again, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And maybe you should do that homework yourself. And yet, it can be hard to do that homework yourself. You do need guides and teachers, and one of the things that Richard Ward writes about is the lack of really healthy elders in our society, and that how are we supposed to train young men to be healthy if the older men aren't at all? So where do we go? What should we do? How do we even get that ball rolling? And where's the balance of when it's okay to go to the women or others in our lives and say help, and when is it not appropriate, and what else? What other tools are there?
I mean, I would say people have. I mean, not everybody does, but if you can cultivate an inner circle, that, and sometimes you literally have to ask, like, I'm trying to make deeper friendships, or I need a mentor. Would you be my mentor? Or really want to be friends with you. Can we hang out once a month?
It's a harder ask than you think. It's nervous.
I know, right?
Would you be friends with me?
I know.
Yeah.
It's and I, because I've done it, and so it's like, but I think once you're out of like a daily environment like school, you kind of have to, like, you have to pursue particular people and like put effort into it, So I think it has to be intentional, and then see what happens. It's not always going to work, right? Like, if you try and like you just are never ever making the coffee date or whatever, then maybe it's not meant to be, right? Or you adjust the way you're connecting because it still needs to be online for now, or the people you're connecting with are far away, so it makes more sense to do a monthly Zoom than trying to do coffee, right? I mean, I will say I have a group that I call the Mama Squad, and it's for women, and we have a forever running Facebook Messenger thread because we have different phones, so we can't do a text thread because that would be annoying. But like, we are the squad, and we are there for each other. But I actually intentionally got this group together. So, but we just didn't fall into a text group, a Facebook group. We had to do it, right? Yeah. So I think that's really helpful.
Lean into that masculine energy that's going to go out in the world and just make
right,
something
exactly.
happen.
Yes, you got to do it. And I think as far as teachers, I mean, it probably sounds stereotypical, and people can do it in a real, like weird, appropriative, yucky way. But like, indigenous peoples, like, particularly we're talking about North American, like if you, right, because this is a Illuman is in North America.
Primarily, we're actually all over the world.
All over the world.
Mostly Europe and North America.
Okay, so everywhere is going to have indigenous peoples to that land. And, I think learning from them, not that they're more pure or some, like, not getting weird with it, but it's like, they do have a knowledge base that we need to understand and learn from, but often that's going to come through relationship. I mean, now there's a lot more people you can read, like you can't, there are more books by indigenous people, and I think reading people of any gender in indigenous cultures, the closer to where you live, the better. But it doesn't even have to be that. I think can be really, really helpful. And there are a lot of indigenous teachers who have books that you can read. But then even if it's possible to form relationships that can be, back and forth, are really helpful. Not just to, like, you pay to go to a thing and you learn from an indigenous man or whatever. It's hard because forming relationships is hard. Like, if you're going to form a relationship with a teacher over years, like, that takes time. So that feels like that's a hard one to say to people, because it's like, how are you going to find that person? I mean, like my community, my indigenous community is, and that's not my primary racial identity, is NAITS, North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. And we do welcome anyone to our symposium every year where we do ceremony, we listen to people present their papers. So it's like both academic and spiritual, but anybody is welcome to that. And, that might not be the community you end up in, but it might form some relationships that would be helpful. And there may be other gatherings that would be similar, especially if you don't want a theological component. So it's hard to give that make friends. I feel like I just said make friends in two different ways or form relationships. But I will also say one other thing. I believe in this concept of mental mentors.
Yeah.
And I have people that I consider my mental mentors. And so it's like I've gotten to know enough about their lives that I feel like I can kind of check in with them in a way. And I try to learn more about their lives, and I'm constantly studying them. And two of my mental mentors are Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, and I have a picture of them on my iPad. So when I speak, I usually speak from my iPad when I speak publicly, and so it's like when I see that, when I open my iPad, it's like, hey, remember who you are, remember who you are, trying to walk in the footsteps of, and it helps me to center myself and remember those commitments to those two very different women who, stood for the kinds of things I want to stand for.
Yeah. So maybe one last follow-up on that. So Illuman gathers men to help other men. In fact, it's kind of one of our taglines is men transforming men. And just because of the nature of where we come from and who we've been, it's mostly white cisgendered men. Not entirely. We do have men of color, and we do have queer and LGBTQ men, and but the predominance is cis white heterosexual men. Does that work? I mean, does it work for men who are kind of dealing with the same thing to gather and help each other heal? And are there any cautions or advice you would have for that?
I think it works. Because I think there's some in-house work, and there's some wider communal work. So I do think it can work. I think it's kind of there's a whole conversation in womanism, womanist theology is can non-black people and women, and can non-black women and can non-women do womanist theology? And I don't know the answer to that. That is above my womanist pay grade. But I do know everyone can learn from womanist theology. Everyone can learn from womanism. So I don't always think it's about, because what we will often do is focus on, we need more variety in the room. We need more diversity in the room. And sometimes your organization isn't going to be diverse. Your church, your community, whatever. It's going to still be what it is.
Yeah.
And it's actually putting a lot of work on the one or two or three people that are different when they come in your space. It's just it ends up potentially and sometimes actually harming your diversities.
Right.
So, but you can still incorporate the learnings from people who aren't a part of your group into the group.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when we think about disability stuff, right? It helps all of us to make our spaces more accessible to disabled people.
Yeah.
People have talked about how, by adding more recording, like Zoom during the pandemic, it has helped so many people who are homebound be involved.
Yeah.
Well, we shouldn't just stop doing anything on Zoom now, because increasing that access has only helped all of us. Yeah. Adding captions only helps all of us. You don't have to be deaf to need captions. There are a lot of reasons somebody might need or want captions. So when we do that kind of thing, it's helpful for anybody. So even if you don't have a black man in the room, adding teachings from black men, or that would be appropriate to black men, learning about black men, using the writings and the teachings of black men, it's going to help everybody. You know, it's gonna expand everybody's learning in life, in multiple ways. So why not?
Yeah.
You know, so that's why I don't like. It will be a blessing to all when we expand both our sources, our teachers who we're in relationship with. Like, I don't think it's just about, right, like whoever's making the curriculum or facilitating, just like, again, picking somebody's book and using it. It's like, you as a facilitator, what is your relationship with people? You might be a white guy who's facilitating, but do you have a black friend, an Asian friend who you can run some of your stuff by and be like, hey man, does this resonate with you? Is this, what do you think about this teacher? Or like, do you like that? I think it's going to help all of the guys who show up for your stuff, even if they don't fit that demographic.
Thank you so much for that. This is that's actually a huge question that there's a really powerful desire within Illuman to become more radically inclusive, radically belonging, where you're not just being included, but that folks of all sorts belong. And we don't always know how to do it. We're struggling, we want this, but how do we get from point A to point B without burning out the folks of color or the, or whomever just to do it, to be our diversity,
right?
But really to integrate what they're trying to teach us and what others are trying to teach us. So thank you for that insight, that advice. Thank you for just having this conversation. This has been fun.
Awesome.